Live. Okay. So we are live. We're live. Want to greet all of you that are joining us anywhere you're joining us in the world. In the name of Okay, y'all, we're back. Come forward. So I was just going to say that I'm grateful for moments like this as a student of our story in my own way. Someone who deeply appreciates the energy and the contribution, the very being, the presence of those who have gone before us, and everything that has been accomplished, in terms of human history. I'm really grateful. It's like being a child in a candy store to get to sit and talk with someone who has made it his life's work to study our story, to document our story, to make it to give it practical meaning for the Okay, we're back. We came forward. Thank you for your patience. So, without being long-winded, I want to greet all of you. Thank you all for joining us today. And for those of you who are going to catch the replay, most of you will catch the replay, and those of you who are catching it on the radio, thank you for tuning in to yourself. This is the Ancestral Rock on your station for progressive information and handpicked quality music. We're blessed today to be joined by someone whose reputation goes before him in a beautiful way, you know, for people of my generation and even older people. You know, a son of the soil of Guyana, a teacher, our historian. I've even heard on occasion that he has some good jokes. Not to say that he would be a stand-up comic or any of that, a prolific writer, an author, one who documents our story in the books so the children can know, so that we can know. So it's an honor to be joined by him today. And as I was saying, we're very serious, although we may not be as sophisticated as some may may look for in terms of the journalism. But even that is something that we're going to get to because it's about a definition and a cultural perspective of things, which really shapes reality. So joining us today is Professor Baba Kimani Nehusi, Dr. Kimani Nehusi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Kofi, for inviting me onto this program. Greetings to you and greetings to all our listeners and viewers. It's especially significant to have a program dedicated to ancestors and ancestral memories, and I wish to congratulate you not only for putting this on, but for maintaining it for 20 odd years. This is something that we should have forever. One of the greatest wounds we've suffered is the rupture with our ancestors. And it's a profoundly important thing you're doing to bring us back into contact, permanent contact and alignment, hopefully, with our ancestors.
We're grateful for Santi Sana Baba, same way. We're grateful for you joining us today and for being who you are, being someone we could feel very confident and excited to call upon based on your body of work. I want to say to the audience, in our physical backdrop is we're a few steps away from the so-called Independence Square in Richard Allen City, otherwise known as Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the first capital of this settler colonialist experiment called United States of America. And Baba, as I was, I had the opportunity to be here with you in Philadelphia, and as I was thinking about a place, I thought about this physical backdrop for many reasons because that's where I want to go today in terms of this having been a major point, a space of activity for the founding of what has been known as the most powerful nation in world history. Of course, that's debatable. We may get into that in terms of what is the definition of true power, but definitely a formidable, empire, United States of America. And I'm thinking of our home country, Guyana, as is the case in so many other parts of the world, where the people are at a very crucial space. The people of the land are at a very crucial space where they're forced again to a decisive moment, moments that could end up like the moments we read about, that you teach about and you've studied extensively, those pivotal moments in world history. It's either that or, one way or the other is going to be a decisive moment.
Yeah.
Crisis, chaos, as Dr. King said, chaos or community, or civilization even. So I know that if we look at this, my premise is that if we look even at the American Revolution as an example, it was multi-layered and multifaceted. And sometimes in the cultural or the political revolutions of the more modern age, they don't seem to be that way. They don't seem to consciously necessarily take on some of the elements other than political ideology. Sometimes it goes to the left, Marxism and various forms of of political ideology. Sometimes almost void of culture and spirit. That's just my observation. Maybe you might see it different, and I'm hoping that through this conversation today we can touch on some of that.
Yeah, I think you're raising not merely an important point, but a fundamental one. In our people's understanding of reality, it's always multidimensional. It's never one dimensional, or sometimes not even two dimensional. So, when we look at a moment like the American War of Independence. America never had a revolution in that sense. It was a war of independence against the British. Um, it was, you said cultural, which is a very important thing. Culture by itself is multifaceted. But if we could put that as one aspect of the situation, it would have been economic also, it would have been political, it would have been environmental, it would have been social. There's so many facets of every situation, and each human being also has a whole number of facets. Sometimes people call them identities. We need not debate about the definitions of and terminology now, but I think it's important for us to understand that all people understood the world and human beings and things within it in a holistic context. So that, for example, you never stop being a parent. You might be a journalist right now. I might be, I don't know what you want to call me, a scholar or something, but that's not the only thing I am. I am quite a few other things. And I never stop being those other things. You never stop being those other things. A situation never stops being multidimensional. And therefore, it is very misleading often, and I think downright dangerous for us to apprehend or attempt to apprehend a single situation only by one aspect of itself.
Talk about the danger. That's a powerful word.
Yes, the danger is that we really don't understand what we think we understand. So, for example, something that is part of the world consciousness today and increasingly part of the discussion about the movement from a unipolar world where America and Western Europeans oppress or attempt to oppress the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is moving more and more away from that unipolar oppression. Well, many of the ruling elites, usually white and men, but sometimes women also, and sometimes people from other communities who've been co-opted to serve the purposes of these people, sometimes consciously, sometimes not. A lot of the white elite still believe that the lies they told themselves and told us about us are true.
True.
So they see us only as sometimes savages.
Right.
Like the French president could go to Africa and utter words like that. And that's all there is to us.
Right.
They see us as people who do not control resources, who cannot uh, do anything. And this is dangerous, not only in the sense that people who oppress us are unconscious of who we really are, but also they make decisions based upon that one dimensional view of us, not really taking into consideration all that we are worth. Some of our own people, due to miseducation and faulty socialization, develop the same view of ourselves. And therefore, thousands of years of our history, meaning of human knowledge, that's organized and stored in indigenous knowledge systems from around the world. All of this goes unrecorded. Sometimes it's deliberately distorted or destroyed, but it's not brought to the use of humanity. So if we, for example, understand that African people were doing brain surgery in Kemet thousands of years ago, not only was that lost to us, but the kind of progress that could have been built upon an uninterrupted practice has also been lost. We see today elements of that practice in our villages in the diaspora, where usually women who are herbalists, they might be midwives, they have cures for almost anything.
Right.
And most of us don't realize that these are survivals from thousands of years of dignified practice in Africa. So our one dimensional view of the South is very, very dangerous because not only does it lead to inaccurate and disastrous conclusions, but also it negates the humanity of oppressed people, and it also um, debars a lot of knowledge, old, tried, and tested human knowledge from being brought to bear upon the problems and
Mm.
challenges of today.
What I hear you saying in a nutshell is that the African proverb, if you think your only tool is a hammer, treat every problem like a nail.
Exactly, exactly. And in thinking that your only tool is a hammer, you don't only display a limitation of thinking,
Mm.
but you limit your thinking and action.
Hence our current situation.
Exactly.
Because I often wonder, as we I wanna back up a little bit and ask you to kind of introduce yourself. But to your point, I often wonder how is it that those types of Africans and indigenous people in different parts of the world that we study, that people like Dr. Van Sertima and Charles C. McIntyre and John Henrik Clark and start calling those names uncovered and reminded us of. How was it that they were conquered by these people who we also know of, who had no education, learned everything they did learn from us, and these are their bastard children. How would this happen? Unless it is something that we lost touch with our true identity.
It's a very, very necessary question.
Mm,
And it's important for all of us to understand the answer
mm,
to it. The loss of identity was a consequence of what happened.
mm,
But I would recommend that we pay attention to what Hekante Diop
mm.
called the two cradle theory.
Yes.
And basically, what Diop was saying is that there are two cradles. Some people modify it to three cradles, and I'll explain that in a moment. Diop was saying that there is a southern cradle,
Mm,
which is basically Africa. And that cradle was community oriented. It was a matriarchal society
mm,
in the sense that men and women respected each other and there was equality between the two.
mhm,
It was a holistic society in the sense that people understood the environment to be a single integrated whole, and that humanity was part of that environment, not apart from it, not superior to it, but part of it. And that if we tampered with any one aspect of the environment for long enough, we threatened, we endangered the entire environment. This is environmentalism before it had that name and before the environmentalists. Giap also understood that there was another cradle, which he called the Northern Cradle, and that housed a group of human beings whose dominant characteristics were nomadism, move about from place to place. They also were warlike, they were individualistic. It's a kind of society that you see dominant in certain parts of the world today. They had no kind of respect for the environment. They had no kind of respect for other human beings, except those who could bash their heads in and generally prevail in a physical way over them. These are barbarians. Now, there was in some people's modification of that theory
mm,
an intermediate zone
mm,
that shared mixed characteristics of that. Basically, what would happen is that people from the barbarian environment would invade the southern cradle, meaning Africa in particular. And in my estimation, because African people didn't have a long history or any history, usually, of strangers coming and behaving in that way. We treat those strangers, or we treated them as human beings. And they scouted us, got to know our weaknesses, and then they butchered us, captured us, enslaved us, and did all kinds of ungodly and inhuman things to us. It's important for us to stop and think about this and realize that it is our attempt to treat them like human beings that resulted in our weaknesses in the sense of being overpowered. We must also conclude that those people have only demonstrated and continue to demonstrate their own inhumanity by treating us in these inhuman ways, and that their greed, their selfishness, their lack of respect for other human beings and the environment, the centuries of that kind of practice is facing them today in the world, because the constant threat of a degraded environment, which has resulted in increasingly high temperatures across the world, the frequency of hurricanes and the frequency in the intensity of hurricanes and floods and other things that people might term as natural disaster. These are all evidences of that 600 and more years of practice of barbarism by Western Europeans around the world. Also, the current movement of the BRICS countries, for example, and their other formations and aspects of that formation. But what I mean by that is the movement to a multipolar world, away from the hegemony of the United States and its Western European allies, mainly in NATO countries. The movement away from those countries is instructed by a negative experience of those people. Here I want to talk about or to mention colonialism, enslavement, imperialism, economic, cultural, and otherwise. So people resented and still resent that kind of presence. And this is one of the drivers of the multipolar world, de-dollarization, and other aspects of the profound changes that are afoot in the world today. Um, we should be very clear that the countries that are heading this are Russia, China, India, Iran, and other countries.
Who have had some experience
Yes,
with.
they either now or from the past now in a certain way. I mean, we know that Western countries invaded China, for example. Britain fought two wars against the Chinese because the British felt that they had a right to sell dope in China. I mean, how ungodly could you be?
And arrogant.
Yes, you know, and we need to be clear that the only thing these people had over the societies they subjugated was military technology and the kind of mentality that instructed the use of that military technology in the most barbarous of ways. You know, these are people who bombed and looted cities because the people chose not to let them in to do their dirty business. So we need to, I hope, understand that history. And by history, I mean the journey of peoples. It's not only a history in the sense of what rulers did or did not do and how they did it. It's what happened to people, large numbers of people in society. It's how their cultures were penetrated, subverted, sometimes erased, you know, and by culture we get to identity. How some people were so inculcated with negative images of themselves that up to today they don't trust themselves to be good. They don't trust themselves to be creative, inventive. They don't believe that they could stand on their own 2 feet and walk or run. or do whatever they want to do.
I truly appreciate that answer, that response. Give us some context. Makes me want to go to, as we dip into this sauce here, into a definition of power, you know? Because as you were talking, I'm thinking from the everyday woman and man on the street in this time, our concept of power. So
Yeah.
even how you mentioned, but before we go there, I want to
Mhm.
let people know you're tuned in with Baba Dr. Kimani Nehusi. Um, as he said, a scholar. I would add a warrior scholar, you know? And he's in that tradition. You know, we called some of those names already of those great warrior scholars who have come before us. And part of what they did was they waged the intellectual warfare, as Nana Jacob Carruthers said, to free our minds. You know, again, being in this city here just brings up a lot of memories. And even to the more modern times, almost immediate history, part of the hip hop golden era, which ushered in more consciousness into an already deeply infiltrated machine of mass influence, you know,
Mhm.
the golden era of hip hop.
Mhm.
A lot of that sprung up right here in this city as well, you know. You know, in terms of people bringing again consciousness into the music between here and New York, you know. So we're here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with our backdrop of the Independence Square and everything, and we're reflecting on the current imperative of independence, the current imperative of human independence, you know, and national independence across many borders since the world is still colonized. I want to ask you, Baba. You know, I know you're the author of many books. The one I haven't read any of them for full disclosure, and
Oh, you got them?
I go no, not
You should
even.
have you should have warned me. I would have brought at least one or two copies.
But what I got to do, I gonna make myself publicly accountable to sip into that pot of wisdom this year, especially this summertime. You know, but you've written books like The People's Political History of Guyana, 1838 to 1964. Then in itself, that's a powerful title. And I've heard this spoken about before, you know, but that's very compelling. I come back home, Perspectives on the Trinidad and Tobago Carnival. What a story set, an oral tradition in the Guyanese village,
No,
Buxton.
that's not right. What the story said.
Oh, I was about to say
I
that's.
think I wrote the introduction or preface
I was
to
going
that
to
one.
say that's very um, reminiscent of my big sister, Dr. Pauline Beard.
Exactly. It's horrible.
Yeah,
That's horrible.
that she have a whole thing called What the Story Said.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, her family was the family that my parents finally entrusted to take me into the church when I found interest in the church.
Hmm.
Nurse Beard and Pauline and Dara and all of them.
Okay.
You know, I used to go 7 day church with them all the
Hmm.
time. You know, and follow them to church. You know, also libation, an
Yeah.
African ritual of heritage in the circle of life. I'm sure I may have skipped over some countless essays and writings,
Mhm. There's another text called Education and Nature.
education and
Yeah.
institution.
You know,
Yeah, yeah. With all of that to say, you have the pen of a ready writer for sure. So outside of this, that is very evident to people. People, you know, of course, can access all those books online. Tell us a little bit more about Kimani News, fundamentally.
I don't know if there's much to say. Um, I'm a boy from Queenstown Village on the Essequibo Coast. Um, I think I was fortunate in two senses uh, related directly to that village. One is that my maternal grandmother, my mother's mother, was a Jordanite. And that means she was an spiritualist, which means she was an African, true and true. And she's one of those people who I'm proud to uh, walk in her footsteps. And I hope that I'm as wise as she was. Um, it's a role model that, it goes deep. And you know, I'm certain that if she had half the opportunities I had, and if she wanted to, she would have become a big noise in anything she chose. That was the kind of brain that I'm talking about. And I'm very, very happy that she is a huge part of my own foundation and consciousness. I think I should tell you and our listeners that a big part in my life's mission came about when one day I was about 12 or 13. She said to me, "Go to school,
Mm.
take back my education, but not make them fool you.
Mm.
You're an African, you know, and what more guidance you want? What more profundity you want to receive from your elders and your ancestors?
Wow.
You are an African. Don't allow them to fool you. Take the education and you use it for your own purposes." This is what she was saying.
That gives me
You know,
goosebumps. That's a
you know,
charge,
exactly.
in the true sense, not just a challenge for it's the cause of intimidation, but she poured into you.
Yeah, profound,
Yeah,
profound,
she poured into you
profound.
in that statement.
Yeah. And the other thing I guess I must be grateful for is the greater environment in Queenstown that I grew up in. Um, we didn't know it, but Queenstown was a very African village. Much of that has disappeared now with the penetration of political organization or organization that call themselves political and other baleful influences. But when I was growing up, Queenstown was a village that was self supporting. It was well organized also. In fact, Queenstown was one of the first villages in Guyana that was organized by African people immediately after the legal termination of certain aspects, usually physical aspects of enslavement that happened in 1838. The people of Queenstown seized that space that was partially opened up and decided to build, to make freedom. How did they do this? They organized themselves. These are one of the first people who say, hey, we are a community and we are organizing local government.
Mm-hmm.
So they appointed an overseer and counselors and so on to run village affairs. They also made it possible, cardinal point, and this is important, that women and all adults were welcome and equal into the council. This is something I think I need to stress, and it happened in other African villages too, until in the 1860s, I think it is, a white British governor passed a diktat that said women and poor people must not be part of village councils.
Mm.
Yep. I mean,
that sounds very deliberate, and
it was.
And because this is a person who knew the power of the women and the poor people. It
Well,
almost sounds like General Howard, who Howard University is named after.
hmm
He said there's three things they would never teach the African people, or former so-called slaves: the science of business, the science of war, and the science of mating. You know.
Well, we have thousands of years of glorious tradition,
Yeah.
long before barbarians like that
Mm-hmm.
came upon the face of the earth in all of those areas. The biggest challenge our people have is recovering that knowledge. And it's there, we could recover much of it, perhaps most of it. But we are not ready yet, or most of us are not ready yet. And therefore, we can't recover it at the moment. But our people have very long traditions of humanity that expresses itself in these fundamental principles like holism, equality, balance, and so on, what the ancient Egyptians called ma'at, but which is found in African traditions before and after ancient Egypt, Kemet, usually by other names, Akani, Ubuntu, and so on.
So, as you were sharing that with us, in terms of those two pivotal experiences, first your grandmother
Yeah,
sharing that, pouring that into you, and then even as
the village organization.
the village culture,
Yeah, let me cut you for a moment and say something about the village. I apologize for interrupting you, but I think it's critical that I mention that as a boy growing up, when there was a village meeting, it was a meeting of the village. The entire village was there, and everybody was equal in saying what they wanted to say. They were listened to, debates were had, conclusions were drawn, and then the representatives went off to implement those decisions. And people were vigilant. At the next meeting, questions would be asked. I didn't notice this being done. What happened, man?
Right.
You know, um, people would be summoned to meeting by a bell crier who went around saying, place and time of the next meeting. People would be told, hey, you got to pay up your rates and taxes, and
Right.
I mentioned that we were a self-sufficient village. We grew um, ground provisions, hard food, as some people call them, a lot of greens and so on. And it was usual for people from other parts of the Essequibo Coast and even Essequibo Islands to come to our village to purchase greens and so on, food that we grew. So, in this way and in other ways, we had an African village. It was a communal existence. If I was on the street as a boy and I did anything that was not complimentary, any adult, the nearest one, could take action to correct me. I mean, it was amazing to many people when I told them that, but it wasn't amazing to us because that was the normal thing. Any adult could correct you. And if your parents found out that you had misbehaved, then it was another uh, piece of correction you could receive because invariably a parent would say something to the effect that, look, I've been training you in this home for the longest while or for how long, and you've gone to the street.
I act like I ain't got no home training.
Yes, you've let me down. You've not insulted me. You've let me down, and things like that.
Right.
So I really treasure those experiences, and especially that model of humanity,
Yeah.
where every adult is a parent, and once the occasion arises and you're available, you took the responsibility of parenting any child. And I've discovered subsequently that even from the deepest history of African people, and here I want to mention ancient Egypt, it was that model.
It was the mother.
You know,
So we never really lost our way fully.
no, and this is something we're going to come back to over and over again when we talk about herbalism,
Right.
when we talk about the village midwife. We're going to come back to this because the first place we see this model is in ancient Egypt, Kemet, and sometimes we know that the model came from even before Kemet, ancient Egypt. So these are important parameters of our existence. And one of my researches right now is really linking some of these or aspects of this model that I have described, reassembled, and described in ancient Egypt with living. And I don't know if you're for me.
I would love to because you're what you see is very exciting for me. One of them, you're doing something that it's not an insurmountable mountain. Question of remembering ourselves and getting ourselves together because often it's presented in that way like it's a burden thing. Boy, we got to do it, but why?
Yeah, but
What you're talking about, if I'm understanding you correctly, that inner question of DNA and everything. It's usually mentioned in many cases in our kind of context. non-practical kind of ancestors and our DNA, and even the word spirit, all those things are very could float above your head easily. And but what you're saying is that this is something that is within us, that is really more about remembrance instead of finding something new.
Yes, and it's the methodologies and processes of remembering, as you said. You see, one of the clever tricks that our oppressors have played upon us is to get too many of us to believe that certain natural methods of retaking ourselves is really either impossible or illegitimate or to be disqualified for some reason or the other. And we need a whole conversation on this. For example, memory. What's memory? And how does it function? Well, one brother named Barnum has written a book about the African unconscious. And what he's saying is that in all human beings, there's a part of the brain that has lodged within it a codified record of the earliest experiences of humanity. And that once we are not trained enough to override it, that thing, that memory, takes charge of our actions and directs our actions in whatever situation we find ourselves. Now, this is a very profound observation, and I think it's true. But before I come to the ultimate demonstration,
So this is in a modern sense, people would probably relate to this as like some kind of MK Ultra thing. You're controlled by a force beyond your conscious recognition.
well, too often it's beyond our conscious recognition because of how we have been taught or mistaught by our oppressors, you know. But when we say our ancestors are inside of us or within us, that's exactly what we mean. And our ancestors were telling us that because they knew that their ancestors were within them, you know. But this thing is important because white psychologists like Freud and Jung, who started to investigate the human unconscious, recognized that this is an African unconscious. And they weren't ready for it because of their own limitations, excuse me, based upon race. In other words, they were frightened, didn't want to believe that the human unconscious is an African unconscious. And that's extremely logical. It cannot be any other unconscious because the first human beings were Africans. And it therefore means that the first human consciousness was an African consciousness.
And
Before
that's
that,
not, and I would add just to ask you, and what you're saying is just not as a fun fact, but it
no,
has practical implications.
of course. I mean, this is purely scientific, logical, psychological, however you want to dress it up, you know, because human beings, all of us today, are the results of a process of what some scientists call evolution. We don't have to agree with the totality at every nook and cranny of the theories, but we recognize that the creature we call human being today evolved over a long period from something else into us. And that therefore things like consciousness and so on, that was also part of our evolution. The first or the archetypes of humanity, whether it's culture, whether it's physicality and so on, they're all African because we were the first human beings. We were the first people to build civilizations. It's no coincidence, you know. So all of this says that the unconscious, that part of the brain that is the first and most fundamental part of the brain, is an African thing, and everybody has it in them. So, you know, people make fun sometimes and say, well, we all come from Africa and we're all Africans. I know some white people really don't mean that and they're making fun. Some people are serious about it because they understand what we're talking about, the profundity of this. And in that way, yes, all of us are Africans, but again, the archetype of humanity are African. And here's how this has been demonstrated in the history of African people in the diaspora and elsewhere, but we don't know. We've never noticed it because of the way in which we've been trained or mistrained to think about ourselves. Well, here's the demonstration. When Europeans terrorized and captured us in Africa and put us to live in the most inhuman conditions on the plantations, one of their objectives was the erasure of African culture and identity. And they banned a lot of the expressions of African culture. For example, libation. That's why libation became just pouring out a few drops of rum or something and say, for those who are not here, but libation is a very elaborate ritual. That's why many external expressions of our consciousness were no longer practiced or truncated. Um, Things like obeah, they banned obeah because they don't realize or never wanted to recognize that obeah is part of an extremely ancient science of the mind and the body and so on. But according to their scholars, Africans usually didn't have culture. I mean, it's a guy named Herskovitz who said, no, this is not true. And, he was problematic in certain ways. But all I'm saying is relatively recently that some European scholars started to acknowledge that African people,
Acknowledging their parenthood.
well, they got various statements on that. But the point I wish to make here is that immediately after the legal termination of some aspects of enslavement in each one of those European colonies, an amazing thing happened. African people, as soon as they were legally free to do so, immediately readapted or remembered and definitely expressed a range of African cultural practices that were not evident. Certainly, in all the history I've read, and I don't claim to have read all of it, but I haven't seen those things in the plantation. So let me mention a few of them. People from Guyana would recognize the box or box hand. The same thing is said in Antigua. In some places like Jamaica, they call it partner. And there are different words for it. But this is a communal thing where a group of people get together. Susu is one of the names for it that comes from Africa and is said in Jamaica and other places. But that's a device that you couldn't find on the plantations before, right? But yet Africans started practicing it.
Immediately after they had the ability to
The freedom, the room.
flex.
Yeah. So how come did we remember that? There is no record, as far as I know, and I would love to find out if there's any, of African people practicing that kind of thing on the plantations. Fact is,
Instinct kicked in.
yeah, well, the plantation was not a money economy.
Right.
So, and even if there was barter or exchange, I don't think that there was room for that kind of practice.
Not at all.
Right?
But although it was suppressed for hundreds of years, you're saying memory kicked in.
Well, I'm saying racial memory. You called it instinct. There are different terms for it, and I think that scholars of this experience would need to examine it some more and come up with appropriate terms if we think that these terms are not appropriate. But
So that was one example.
Yeah, I was about to say that. There are other examples I could think about what we call secret societies.
Mm-hmm.
Now, by the very nature, these societies could have been in existence on the plantations, and I don't doubt that. But again, there was a certain strength in which these societies sprang into public view, and they weren't always displayed in public as what we call secret societies. Malefi Asante pointed out that these were not really secret societies, they were societies of secret. But because Europeans were not admitted because of bad behavior, usually,
Right.
those organizations or that group of organizations, as well as many other African things, derogatory names.
They give them a bad name.
Yeah, but
That's interesting.
yeah,
I don't want to cut your flow. It's just the irony is so real though, because I remember a time where in the African conscious community, the Sankofa community of the 20th century, the latter 20th century, especially the late part, the whole thing of secret society was looked upon as draconian, or that's usually the angle that it's spoken on. We talk about Freemasonry and all these other things. Looked upon as, well, these are the people who run the world. These are the people who are the puppet masters of the poor, that type of thing. But you're saying that none of that, in terms of the framework, are related, where, or at least that's not what you're saying, but at least these societies in the African framework in a more constructive manner, in a matter that is more beneficial to all men. Yeah.
as an aside, we mustn't forget that Europeans often raided the African store of knowledge and misappropriated things that were attractive to them and applied them in their own situations for their own purposes that were not always in the purpose of humanity. And the kind of society we're talking about is one of those. Um, these societies existed in Africa for thousands of years. They were certainly in Kemet, ancient Egypt, and I believe that they existed even before then. Nevertheless, it's interesting that Europeans would give a derogatory name, secret society. So the same organization, when it's found in other parts of Africa, but they called it the lodge when they saw it in ancient Egypt, and they copied it. So all the grand lodges and so on, that's the origin of the idea. I'm not saying the practice is the same, but I think that if you go to many of the lodges, you're going to see geometrical instruments, and that tells you where it comes from. That's from ancient Egypt, and even some of the writings, right? Somebody brought me a book one day, and it was about a lodge or lodges or something. So, and when I read the thing, it was really ancient Egyptian. Um, it's a kind of a slogan they had, and it was really ancient Egyptian, you know. So um, that's the source of that. And my point is that African people, wherever they remained African, even after thousands of years of developmental trajectories that may have diverged partially, you still had these organizations in West Africa, for example, where many of our people were captured from. Now, we don't know that they survived in the practice of the plantation. But what I'm certain about is that immediately after the so called freedom, partial freedom, they sprang back. In Guyana,
So that has to be said. I mean, just for the sake of what we're talking about here and putting a practical stamp, our practical image and reality with memory and spirituality. It definitely survived.
Yeah, this is
They
what I'm saying.
survived.
Yeah, and I'm about to give you
It's
examples.
like them seeds that go through the winter
And they're dormant.
and they're dormant and they
Mhm.
don't even spring back up sometimes for a couple of years.
Right. In hostile conditions,
Hmm.
they don't spring back. They conserve their energy.
Hmm.
And as soon as conditions are favorable,
Hmm.
you see that bloom.
Hmm.
And this is what happened, right? So, for example, in 1840 something, perhaps 1840 itself, the Guyana Teachers Association, the British Guyana Teachers Association, was formed. It didn't have exactly that, but this was an organization that was formed to better the professional development of teachers. Now, this model is what you find in Africa up to today, where there are certain organizations, okay, we're farmers or we're goldsmiths or whatever. There's a professional organization that establishes standards and that regulates the attainment of those standards. One of the things it would do is provide a mechanism for training and graduation, right? Now, this was what the Guyana Teachers Association was, and there are other organizations that sprang up based on that model. And I wouldn't doubt it that some of the more popular organizations, like villages and so on, may have been influenced by that kind of model. Now, it is also true that because many of our people didn't know the origins of the lodge, they also joined the lodge that they got from Europe, which Europeans got from us, but we didn't know at that point in time. So, you had that kind of thing developing in Guyana. There are other examples of institutions that were immediately expressed by public presence in Guyana and in other parts of the colonized African world that didn't appear to have a visible uh, before. You know, so the lodge, the box or the box hand, they're cooperatives of various um, measures that were implemented. I mean, the village is a cooperative in a certain way.
That's true.
You know,
So you're talking about very practical things. I hate to keep using that word. Very tangible things which help the flow of human life to continue.
yeah.
Not just something that is kind of like extracurricular.
No, no, no,
Once in a
no.
while, Africans had kites that they flew, or once in a while, you're talking about the building blocks of civilization, basically.
Exactly. That's very important. These are some of the most fundamental values of humanity and the specific ways in which they were practiced in African communities. And I want to step back because the idea of the cooperative spirit and we need to talk about spirit, I believe, specifically, but here we're talking about the cooperative spirit. The moment you begin to investigate Africa in from its earliest visibility, meaning the first human beings, almost immediately, you see the organization of society in such a way that the iron rule is always that the collective, the interest of the collective is more important than the interest of any group or individual that is smaller than the collective. Now, this is a fundamental principle of African society everywhere. And this dictated the way in which we organized our communities. And if we want to look at political organization, well, the oldest African society we know today, or one of the oldest, is the San people, Khoisan in Azania, South Africa. If you look at the Khoisan, the Society was nomadic, but the water hole was the most precious commodity they had because in a desert, harsh desert environment, you needed that water. Everybody needed water. Well, the person we might call the chief in our this language that we use, he controlled the water hole, but he didn't control it for his personal
Mhm.
or for the personal interest of his family. He controlled it on behalf of the community. That's how he regulated it. When
Because it was for
African
the common good.
for the common good, when African people organized sedentary society, you know, the most valuable commodity was the land after human beings. The chief did not own the land. All the authorities tell you that. No chief owned the land. The chief regulated the use of the land in the interest, the best interest of the community. So these are principles that dictated the existence of our people. This principle became so ingrained, if you wish, in us that it was a fundamental principle in the organization of society, community, and society wherever we resided. And in Guyana, you see the same thing. Many of us don't understand fully that those village or villages, as we say, that were formed in that glorious period immediately after 1838, each one was really a cooperative. And secondly, the villages was just one part of what our ancestors were aiming at. They were organizing an entire civilization that was different from the plantation barbarism, the organized barbarism organized by Europeans on the plantation. They were, your parents were the first people in Guyana to write this, in Scars of Bondage. Our ancestors were organizing a civilized alternative to what the Europeans did.
That's
You know.
the, the foremost point for me in my mind, if I'm to be transparent in this moment, knowing the consciousness of youth and youth, the power dynamics, and the way they define power dynamics, the way they perceive power dynamics.
Mhm.
Because all of this that we're sharing could be just for vanity if it's not going to impart some inspiration, to wake up a one, just as it was done for yourself, I'm sure, for myself, I'm thinking of power, and I'm loving how we're flowing because I want to go there. I want to go to Guyana. Let me just pause to say you're tuned into the Ancestral Rock on your station for progressive information and handpicked quality music. WRFG Atlanta, 89.3 on the FM dial, WRFG.org. Greetings to all of you joining us on the various social media platforms. Thank you for liking and sharing the video. Shadow banning and all that kind of stuff don't bother us because we know, as the proverb says, the voice of the people is the voice of God. So thank you for liking and sharing the video to help with the algorithms and all them things there, and just sharing a good word with your neighbor. Let them know that we're talking about ourselves, in a very powerful way, in a very uplifting way, I would say. I'm grateful for our guest, Baba Dr. Kinani Nehusi. He's the author of several books. He's is it officially a professor? You would say that. I would say that, right? Professor. I mean, there's an official title, and then there's the reality of the matter.
Yeah.
The people's professor, even a long-standing, scholar and teacher in the school systems, in the university system of these Western lands. And we're here just grounding, literally, figuratively. It's funny though, because there's a word now. There's a big corporate 500 word, grounding,
Well, I mean, it's
and all these things. I mean, are they just talking about walking barefoot like how I'm sure you grow up? I grew up
yeah,
from top to bottom in Buxton,
yeah.
raiding people's mango tree and all these things there, barefoot.
Oh yes, oh yes.
And this was a thing that was frowned upon at one time,
Mhm.
based on the social structure. There's so many different ways to go in this conversation, such a rich conversation because we have a guest with us that is a fountain of knowledge, in the tradition of our warrior scholars. So again, we're grateful. I was just thinking, about how I lost my train of thought. I lost my train of thought. It was something that was coming to, and I had written that down. Even as a when I was taking some notes preparing for this interview. What is it that happens exactly when one loses one's train of thought? This is literally a note, and as it relates to
Mhm,
what we're talking about with the
mhm.
trajectory of our people.
Yeah, sometimes you might have another thought intervening,
Hmm.
and it kind of knocks that one aside, and you just can't recall
You
it
can't recall it in a
immediately.
moment.
But you're going to get it back.
Yeah, definitely,
Just stay calm. That
definitely,
staying calm is such a very important thing in almost any situation, really.
indeed,
You know.
indeed. But
But
it just brought to my mind that what I was preparing for today when I was just meditating and just thinking about things I would like to ask you. Because your time is precious. We value your time. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to be with us. But when we go to Guyana now, and one of the things you mentioned earlier in so many different ways, you've already demonstrated in different ways, is that we're talking about a culture whose facets make up the building block of a civilization. And it might be sounding redundant, the culture and then the civilization after saying all them fancy words. But we have to articulate it in that way because of the miseducation of the Negro.
mhm,
Even the word culture
mhm,
in this, there was a trend the last 10 years that you call somebody, even the last 5 years, to call somebody who was kind of a self-righteous person, a hotep. Imagine. That's the word in the
mhm.
pop culture
Yeah.
to describe a parasite, a person who uses his or her knowledge to manipulate people. A
Yeah.
hotep.
Mhm.
That's how the thing get twisted up.
Well, I teach ancient Egyptian language,
Yes,
Middle Nature or hieroglyphs in graduate school
yes,
at Temple University, and I explain to students what Hotep means, and I think I try to explain it in the book on libation. And the profundity of meaning doesn't permit us to do the kind of misrepresentation that is done when you call somebody who is an abuser,
right,
that kind of word.
right.
But this is the kind of thing that happens and a community allows to happen
Mhm.
when we don't know enough about ourselves
Right.
and we are not vigilant in the defense of our own business, our own well-being. You know, I've mentioned Ma'at in this conversation, and one of the things about Ma'at that I want to repeat is that our people understood very clearly that all reality is interrelated, and that if you allow any one aspect of reality to be damaged and continue to be damaged for long enough, eventually you're going to threaten the entire system. It's the same with words. If we allow other people to define us, we wouldn't have a sense of worth. And I find this in many of our communities.
Mhm.
Let me give you one example of what I mean. If you and I, especially if we put on white robes,
Mhm.
and we go to the roadside of any one of our communities, and we light up some candles and incense and so on.
Yeah, man.
Exactly. But the very people who look down on that and call us obia men in a sense that's meant to be derogatory,
Yeah,
they would go to an English church
yeah,
where the same practices are done,
yeah.
and that the Christians got it from us, by the way, right? But they would never even think of demeaning that practice. That is how much we have lost consciousness of ourselves, and we fail to see when our common interests are being demeaned. We permit ourselves and other people to call us by words that are nasty, misleading, and demeaning. We say not a single thing about it. On the other hand, there are several other communities. You don't call them something that they don't like. It's a huge, huge outcry you're gonna get.
Yeah, serious thing.
Yeah.
It's a serious thing.
So this is one of those things that tells us about how weak we have become, and therefore how much more we need to do to regain our consciousness and act in the spirit of our own people, especially our ancestors.
Sure, sure. Redefine reality.
Yes.
So these things that we have. I mean, I think of so many small things that became big things. Little noni bush
Hmm.
that we have in Buxton, all over the Caribbean. All over Guyana for sure. I've seen it many other places. That used to they call it painkiller bush when I was a boy. Used to pelt dogs with that. Used to play cricket with that if you didn't have a ball to bounce. This became a huge sensation. And then the same tree that would rot underground, most of the fruits would rot underground. You couldn't find a noni. 2 o'clock in the morning, teeth man going up people's tree to get this noni because now it's a huge hit.
Hmm.
And this happens again and again and again and again and again. Things that we possess within ourselves. But I want to ask you though, to the person who would say, well, all of this is good information. It's fancy. However, you're talking about a village movement of antiquity, or you're talking about your memories from 40, 50, 60 years ago. You're living in the past. It's not practical. There is a thing that I want to ask you, uh, but the way that it was put was so profound in a film called Life and Death. Sure, you might have seen that film about the IMF
I'm not
dealing
very
with
good with it.
Jamaica. It,
Oh,
it,
maybe,
yeah, it
maybe.
was a real good film. But
Mhm.
in this film, is a farmer from Jamaica is saying basically, we have machete and they have machines. How can machete compete with machine? So I want to ask you that question there, even as we go to our homeland, Guyana. For those of y'all who joining us, both of us, your host with Ancestral Rock, as well as our esteemed guests, come from Guyana, South America. If you never know, now you know. So it's an invitation in a sense to take an all expense paid trip to a place we come from as a macrocosm of the microcosm, as an example of what is probably happening in your neighborhood. But as we go to Guyana, how would you really answer that question again?
Well, I'll take it from one of the sayings that were common in Guyana, and you probably would recognize this. They would say things like, "It's not the steering wheel, it's the man behind the steering wheel." So it's not the machete or the machine, and the people behind that. It doesn't matter where on the road to development you begin and how you begin. Once you have that sense of purpose and you're organized enough, you're going to get there.
Nothing can stop you.
Nothing. And I think the world is witnessing that truth.
It's true.
If we just step back a bit, let's look at a country like Russia, right? Right now, the country that considers itself and is considered by many to be the most powerful country in the world, the United States, they put thousands of sanctions on the Russian economy, and the current president of the United States, Mr. Biden, not too long ago said that the Russian currency, which is the ruble, would become rubble. He's got to eat his words now. Now, why is that so? How come? Well, I don't know the all the answers and the fineries and so on. And I'm not pretending that I know these things. But from my own humble observation, I think that there's a storyline that begins before the Russian Revolution in 1970, when the Russian people were the most, how we say, backward and poor people in Europe. Other Europeans used to laugh at them. Then the Russians made their revolution. Other European countries, including America, sent troops to keep that revolution down and dismember it. So they had to fight and undergo a whole lot of destruction there. Yet they retained power, and they also made some of the greatest sacrifices in what is called the Second World War of 1939 to 1945. Destruction, the loss of over 25 million of their people. But guess what? By 1960, Russia, this place that was so backward, be, had been educated in Plato. And by 1960, they had certainly caught up in certain aspects of human progress with America, which considered itself and perhaps was correctly considered to be the foremost country in the world. If we look at technology, who put the first satellite, human satellite in space? It was the Russians, Sputnik. Who put the first woman in space? The Russians. Who put the first human being, Yuri Gagarin, in space? It was the Russians. Valentina Tereshkova, who was the first woman in space, would come after him. Now, there are many other firsts that the Russian people did. And the point I want to make is that at a certain point in time, if people looked at the comparatively low level of technological development between Russia and the United States, say, or England, we might have made the same kind of observation that our brother in Jamaica made. You know, we got machete and they got machines.
David and Goliath.
Yeah. But it's not necessarily so. And, you know, from 1917 to 1960, it's not a long time in the history of the human being of humanity. And despite those many obstacles, challenges, and setbacks that they face, the Russian people have come a long way. I think you could say the same thing about the Chinese, you know, and there are other people who've made tremendous progress. So to me, it's not what you have in terms of the tools and the technology, is what you have in terms of your own human capacity for organization and releasing the collective energy of your people who would work in an organized and sustained way to achieve certain common goals. And I mean, there's so much we could look at. All right, let me give you another example. I mean, right now, one of the two biggest conflicts in the world is the one between the Zionist state of um, Israel and its Arab neighbors and the Palestinian people upon whose land the state of Israel has ensconced itself. 10, 20, and more years ago, it was clear that the Zionist state had very advanced technology when it was compared to its Arab neighbors and rivals. And that was so because other Europeans, especially the United States, gave the Zionist state a lot of technology and money and organizational knowledge and so on. Well, Israel used to act with impunity, you know, in the affairs of those other people. Well, I think that the Arab states, especially, or Muslim states, especially Iran, started to develop its own technology. And in our lifetime, we've seen an increasing proficiency in the development of that technology. Now, I don't think we need to be detained about whether they're good or bad, justified or unjustified. I think they're very justified to develop their own technology in defense of their own interests. And look what's happening today. You know, Israel could no longer act with impunity.
Can't just push people around.
No,
I feel like they get no kickback.
Right. And the other
necessity became the mother of invention.
Well, many inventions in this case. Sometimes copying and then inventing off those copies. But the fact remains that not too long ago, those people were minuscule in terms of the capacity, not capacity, but the technology that they had. You can't say that anymore. And again, this is not a long time. So Any group of people who are organized enough and motivated enough could achieve remarkable results. And I think that those examples offer us that lesson. But too often, African people don't know enough about ourselves, don't know enough about what our own people have accomplished in our history, and therefore don't have the cultural confidence to do things. You know, we've been given so many negative examples of ourselves that we're discouraged from believing
Precisely.
that we could amount to something.
But this is why we're so honored to have you here today, as an example. This is why we play clips from Walter Rodney and Amos Wilson, and we start naming those names, because of their persistent efforts in the Sankofa journey to help us to remember.
Yeah.
Just think as simple as the eagle who thought there was a chicken. Imagine you're an eagle
Mhm.
and have all kind of abilities, but you're stuck in the foul yard the whole time because you think you're just a chicken because you were raised to feel like you were a chicken.
Yeah, there's a very profound statement by one of our ancestors
Mm.
from the ancient Nile Valley, and we're talking about easily 4 to 6,000 years ago.
Mm.
And that statement says, you could do anything, blah, blah, blah. Who you are is who you think you are. In other words, if you think you can't do it, you'll never do it. But if you think that you could do it or you know you could do it, it's not a problem. You're going to try again, you know? And I discovered this in track and field.
Mm-hmm.
There were people with the ability, but they didn't want to push their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who, as soon as they felt that kind of pain that you got to go through in order to extend your proficiency, they stopped because they never believed they could make it. There are other people who ran and got near to a time and they felt it, the tiredness in the body and so on, but that's part of their journey. You know, they know that they could do it because they almost did it. And they know what it is to do it. They know the kind of pain they will feel, or they know they got to go and do more training in order not to feel that intensity of pain because the body is more adjusted to the kind of pressure, you know. But these are all aspects of our becoming. Once we take the decision to become all that we could become, you know, if we want to achieve,
Unstoppable.
sorry, go ahead.
No, no, sorry. I was just saying it's unstoppable.
Well, that's it.
Once we take that step.
That's
You're
what's being
tuned to the
put forward.
Ancestral Rock family. Again, thank you for liking and sharing the video, and that's for those of you who are catching this live, and even after when you're catching the replay. I see you passing through. It's the middle of the day, coming to the end of the business day. Uh, we're in the month of June, to date this conversation, and all over the world we're feeling, especially all over the Western world right now, and especially on this Turtle Island, we're feeling the heat. We're feeling the ramifications of the climate change. We know it's real. And we're in the midst of this rising energy. Even on the rising moon, we just had the new moon. According to what astrology you follow, it would be in the sign of Gemini or in the sign of what would that be, Aries. But regardless, if you're 13 moon, 12 moon, we're just in very revolutionary times, evolutionary times, and we're grateful to have Baba Kimani Nehusi with us, giving us some historical context, our historical context to that evolution. So then we can see ourselves in the picture, and we not only be observers again, but participants in our own liberation. So thank y'all for tuning in to yourself. Again, there's so much you've raised, that so many different places we can go, in terms of just the fundamental aspects of a people's reality, a people's culture as a tool even for political change. And I'm really grateful for the examples you've given us on a cellular level, as well as, we've spoken about Haiti, we've spoken about Russia, we've spoken about China. It's interesting even addressing our country, Guyana. The irony is not lost in terms of the revolution that you chose to share as an example because one of the major forces in the political education of Guyana became Marxism under Shelley Jagan, especially, And it's the irony is because now his party is as capitalist as they can come. It went from workers of the world unite to come all ye imperialists and come rape our country. So it's interesting how tides shift.
Yes, and there are things about Chetty's version of Marxism we could discuss. But I think an important point to notice is that very recently, one of the young representatives or younger representatives of the ruling party in Guyana today, Chetty Jagan's party, the PPP, I don't know if Chetty will recognize it, but one of the younger representatives of that party made a statement that was explicitly against hostile to communalism, to the cooperative, and in favor of individualism. And I'm not very certain if this guy understood that he was speaking in favor of greed and other weaknesses in humanity, the triumph of those things. But this is what he said,
Essentially.
And I'm not too confident that the founders of that party would have agreed with that. I'm absolutely certain that in the original PPP, and I'm talking here about the PPP before 1955, I'm certain they would not have agreed with it. And this includes Dr. Jagan, Janet Jagan, your father, is Wayana, Forbes Barnum, Brinley Ben, and all of those people.
It's funny how things shift. However, what you've shared with us today, even as an introduction, has given us some context to see how not just things shift, but how we can shift things, which is the most important, which is most important to show the people how they can shift things. As I know you understand, I don't have to explain. Proverbs mean the world to me because they say so much and so little.
That's the philosophy, the wisdom of collective wisdom of our people.
Yes, there's a proverb that talk about how it's much more important what you teach a child to love than what you help them to learn.
Exactly. That's deep. That's deep.
In the farm, we have a concept called plant positive, and it's really based on the same premise, fundamental premise, which is that our optimal state of being, of acting, of thinking, of just being, is homeostasis, what they would call homeostasis. Peace, joy, and power. That's our birthright. And it's funny, a little sad that we even have to expound that in 2024, to remind ourselves and people of that. Like, joy is not a thing that is an extracurricular thing. This is part of your birthright. So on the farm, when we talk about plant positive instead of pest negative, even when the question arises, well, how do we rid this? Oh, I fear of my callaloo because something eating up my callaloo, or something eating up my corn, and it's not a deer. Something is ravaging my lettuce. And so the tendency would to be going for even a natural, even a ital, if we would, a remedy. But the fullness is that the best remedy, the first tier of defense, is healthy soil and just building a strong plant. Because parasites do not go for strong plants. Parasites are only attracted to weak cells. Parasites cannot live without a host. So the first tier of defense is not even defense in the sense of how we look at it, but it's just being our full, authentic selves. And that's what I feel that you've demonstrated today in these few moments.
Well, I thank you for that. I hope I could continue to go forward.
I got to invite you publicly to come forward because this is a conversation. Dr. Clark is strong on my mind today as I keep invoking his name. He said, let us bring to a conclusion a thing that has no end.
I hear you. I mean, there's a lot in even that we mentioned
Yeah,
that needs further exploration
yeah,
in this one conversation. I mean, the whole question of the example of the revolution in Haiti, you know, that's one of them. The what we mean by environmentalism and how our people practice that. I mean, there's so many things, but I hope that we could continue that conversation and based upon those, or at least specifically some of those issues that we just kind of
touchdown.
glanced.
Yeah, we touched
Yeah,
on.
yeah.
I would like to see, look, just give us a primer, if you will. Just give us some homework, even. Talking about spirit,
Hmm.
more specifically,
We didn't
spirit.
even speak
We
about
didn't
spirit.
speak about spirit,
Mhm.
in that sense. But even though we've been talking about it the whole time,
Yeah.
how it shows up in the world, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Talk about spirit, and again, for full disclosure, I'm not coming with no backhanded stuff. A big concern of mine is that our revolutionary cadre have often been convinced that spirit is immaterial, which it is in a sense. In a sense,
Yes. Okay. Yes.
in a sense, in a sense,
But in the correlation of forces, it becomes
are definitely irrelevant.
well, it's not irrelevant.
Something that you just focus on in your own time. And so
No,
I
no,
want
no.
to talk about spirit from that perspective, that from
Hmm.
the perspective that we're talking about today. Again, in the backdrop of this Constitution Hall, where the Declaration of Independence was signed, and something they tapped into something to
Hmm.
be able to manipulate energy for so long
Yes.
with evil intentions.
Yeah.
Talk about spirit.
Well, spirit is a certain kind of consciousness
Mm,
that is even more fundamental than consciousness.
mm,
It's more rooted, grounded than consciousness because your consciousness is an expression
mm,
of spirit.
mm,
Um, sometimes,
mm.
and spirit is an intangible force that tells you what to do, how to do it. Very often, it's how to do things, and that how is so fundamental that it often becomes what you know. Um, and the spirit represents a certain set of standards and a certain quality of existence or striving for existence and a style, the way or ways in which you strive for that kind of existence. We could see that spirit is very fundamental. It's not anything that's very close, very narrow definitions and so on. It's a very broad definition of humanity. But the African spirit is something that we see wherever African people go. And I would use this in order to demonstrate spirit. Here I'm using the manifestations of spirit to point towards spirit because very often in a conversation like this, that definition isn't, well, it's elusive.
Yes, yes.
So it doesn't matter where in the African world you go, you see a certain style. We talk, we're the best talkers, or we're usually the best talkers. We got a certain style in which we dress, in which we walk. We say, I am somebody. Look at me. You just gotta look at me. We do things with that kind of distinctive style. There's no one small style, but it's broadly a certain distinction in how we carry ourselves. In the colors we wear, you know, um, you go all over the African world and you're going to see people put certain blend of colors together.
Magic.
I mean, in England, I lived in England for a while,
Mm,
and I interviewed so many people,
mm,
not always formally,
mm,
but the fact is that before African people, whether from the Caribbean or directly from the continent, arrived in England en masse, they dressed in a very drab manner. It was always black or dark. And if it's a formal occasion, you would have a black suit with a white short.
mm.
Now, you know what happened when we arrived there, right? A riot of colors. And many of the English people were prejudiced against scholars. It's no longer so. We've changed the color scheme of that nation, you know. And I say this just to mention one way in which the African spirit has expressed itself. But we could go around the world. Let's look at the colonized world when we were not supposed to be ourselves. The African spirit has expressed itself repeatedly in communal action, in organizations that say we need to tackle this together. We've been repeatedly subverted, but we've come a long way, you know. So the African spirit tells us that we must be communal, that we must recognize, understand, get to know, and incorporate our ancestors. This is not anything that is taught. I hope that it will be increasingly taught so that we could understand it more. But we all know this. We all come to these conclusions. The African spirit expresses itself even in the European church. Uh, a machine, an institution that was abused to do the worst kind of thing, the worst crime to us, mental imprisonment. You know, you go to an African church and the preacher says, "Come on, somebody say something." And the congregation says something. Hallelujah. That's African calling response. You know, somebody playing some music and it's soul music because that's the African spirit expressing itself. Spirit and soul in certain conversations are really the same thing, you know. And a brother or a sister will get up and start dancing, and the whole community in that church will start going with them, despite the fact that that institution was meant to imprison us in the most fundamental way, mentally. African spirit expresses itself there all the time. And unless we could begin to understand this kind of thing about ourselves, we will not understand ourselves enough.
That's deep. As we see what I'm hearing you say in one way, one interpretation is the African spirit, as you're calling it, is a raw material which can be used for many different things, like flour, which can be used for, it can be manipulated for different things. But it's a presence,
Yep,
all by itself.
it is a presence because it is felt. You know, you can't touch it; it touches you. You know, and if we organize it with the higher purpose and we are motivated, there's nothing that could stop us. I mean, look at our brothers and sisters in Haiti who defeated 5 European armies. We were supposed to be backward. We weren't supposed to be able to organize anything. We certainly weren't trained. But we defeated France under Napoleon twice. When Napoleon Bonaparte led the world's military superpower, he sent his own brother-in-law, Leclerc, at the head of an army. Africans using voodoo, the African spirit, a certain encoding and expression of the African spirit, a specific one, not a specific spirit, but a specific organization and expression of the African spirit. They defeated him. The British sent an army. The British would be the world superpower very soon. That army was defeated. A Spanish army was defeated, and an army of mulatto and white counter-revolutionaries were defeated. Now, that's one of the most famous, well, not famous because it's not well known, but that's one of the most profound uh, achievements, feat of arms. That is not well known, and there's a reason why it's not well known because it's African excellence displaying itself, and the African spirit triumphant in a specific area of military engagement, organization, and execution. And Europeans, the people who run the system of miseducation that subjects most of us, they're not anxious for us to know that. Think about if the boys and girls in any African community understand the lessons of that experience, of that example.
You're talking about that. There's a film called The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind.
Okay.
It's a serious thing. And we're going to seal up here for the sake of the battery.
Mhm.
It's funny, I'm looking to the side of us here, and I'm seeing a sign that says freedom is a light for which many have died in darkness. that
That talks about us.
is a serious seal to the thing.
Mhm.
Baba Kinani Nehusi, thank you for joining us. And we trust this won't be the last time. We kind of already laid out an outline of things we need to talk about one by one. And I really appreciate your scholarship, because as I have to say time and time again, it's I would say street relevant scholarship. You make it plain. Clearly, you've done much study, continue to do much study in order to translate something in plain terms for the people who need it the most. So we're grateful for your service to humanity, service to our people, and we're looking forward. We're looking forward to dig deeper into Haiti. Just a seal on that note, because look what, with all the political sophistication and everything, boy came on. They
Always that.
set off. They set off the Haitian Revolution in an alligator swamp. In an alligator swamp, and there was cooperation with the alligators. And this is not just some kind of thing. It was a nice party. Everybody get drunk, and then boy, that was a blast. This set off the Haitian Revolution. You know, I mean, it's serious. So we thank you so much for joining us, family. Stay tuned to yourself at all times. Free the people, free the land. Take the power in your hand.